The Russo-Ukrainian War is not a conflict that began suddenly in 2022. Its current phase did begin with Russia's full-scale invasion on February 24, 2022, but the war itself began 8 years earlier, in 2014. Since then, it has moved through several connected stages: the occupation and annexation of Crimea, the war in eastern Ukraine's Donbas region, years of trench-like fighting and broken ceasefires, and then a massive escalation into the largest war in Europe since World War II. To understand why this war has been so destructive and so difficult to end, it is important to see it as one continuous conflict over Ukraine's sovereignty, territory, and future direction. At its core, the war is about whether Ukraine can exist as an independent state able to choose its own political and security path, or whether Russia can use force to limit that independence. The immediate background was Ukraine's Revolution of Dignity in early 2014. Before it, Ukraine had been led by President Viktor Yanukovych, a pro-Russian leader whose government faced mass protests known as Euromaidan. These protests were driven by anger over corruption, repression, and Ukraine's political direction. When Yanukovych was ousted and fled the country, Russia treated the political change in Kiev as a threat to its influence. Ukraine had long been caught between closer ties with Europe and pressure from Russia, but the fall of Yanukovych marked a decisive moment. For many Ukrainians, it was a popular uprising for democracy and national self-determination. For the Kremlin, it became a justification to intervene. Almost immediately after the revolution, events shifted from political crisis to military confrontation. The first major military move came in Crimea. In February 2014, unmarked Russian troops occupied the peninsula, seizing key sites and surrounding Ukrainian forces. Russia initially obscured the identity of these troops, but their role quickly became clear. In March, Russia held a referendum in Crimea and then announced that it was annexing the territory. Ukraine and most of the international community rejected the vote as illegitimate, because it took place under military occupation and outside Ukraine's constitutional process. Crimea was strategically important. It hosted Russia's Black Sea Fleet and gave Moscow a powerful position in the Black Sea. But the annexation was more than a territorial grab. It was a direct challenge to the post-Cold War European order, where borders were not supposed to be changed by force. While Crimea was being absorbed by Russia, unrest spread in parts of southeastern Ukraine. In the eastern Donbas region, Russian-backed militants seized towns and cities in April 2014. They proclaimed the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic as independent states. Ukraine's government viewed these entities as illegal separatist projects backed by Moscow. Russia denied direct control, but evidence of support grew as the conflict intensified. The separatists received weapons, fighters, tanks, artillery, and other assistance that allowed them to hold territory against Ukraine's military. What began as armed seizures of local government buildings became a sustained war. The Donbas conflict turned into the second major front of Russia's pressure on Ukraine after Crimea, creating a long-running battlefield inside Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. The war in Donbas became complicated because it was both local and international. On the surface, fighting involved Ukrainian forces and separatist formations calling themselves republics. But international courts later recognized Russia's deeper role. The International Criminal Court judged that the conflict had both national and international dimensions involving Russia, while the European Court of Human Rights found that Russia controlled the Donetsk and Luhansk separatist entities from 2014 onward. This matters because it challenges the idea that the Donbas War was simply a civil war. It was also a proxy and cross-border conflict shaped by Russian military power. Ukraine could not fully retake the territory because Russia's covert intervention changed the balance. The result was a frozen but violent war, with front lines hardening over time. In 2015, Russia and Ukraine signed the Minsk II agreements, a diplomatic attempt to stop the fighting and create a path toward a political settlement. The agreements called for a ceasefire, withdrawal of heavy weapons, and steps related to local governance in the occupied areas. But the deal was never fully implemented. Each side accused the other of failing to meet its obligations, and ceasefires were repeatedly broken. Over the following years, the Donbas front increasingly resembled trench warfare. Soldiers lived under shelling, snipers, drones, and constant uncertainty, while the line of contact barely moved. This period is sometimes overlooked because it lacked the dramatic scale of the 2022 invasion, but it was still a real war. People were killed, communities were divided, and Ukraine remained under military pressure. The first 8 years of the war also included more than land battles. There were naval incidents, especially around Crimea and the Black Sea, as Russia sought to strengthen control over maritime space. Cyber warfare also became a major part of the conflict, with Ukraine facing repeated digital attacks on institutions, infrastructure, and public systems. These tools allowed Russia to pressure Ukraine without always escalating into open conventional war. By 2018, Ukraine formally declared the Donbas territories occupied by Russia, reflecting its view that Moscow was not merely supporting local forces but exercising decisive control. At the same time, the war pushed Ukraine further away from neutrality. When the conflict began, Ukraine was officially non-aligned, but Russia's actions revived and strengthened Ukraine's interest in joining NATO for protection. Beginning in 2021, the conflict entered a dangerous new stage. Russia began a massive military buildup near Ukraine's borders, including forces positioned in neighboring Belarus. Moscow repeatedly denied that it planned to invade. At the same time, Russian leaders made sweeping political demands. President Vladimir Putin questioned Ukraine's right to exist as a fully separate nation and demanded that Ukraine be permanently barred from joining NATO. These demands were not just about military bases or alliances, they were about Ukraine's sovereignty and the limits Russia wanted to place on it. In early 2022, Russia recognized the Donetsk and Luhansk separatist entities as independent states. As Russian troops surrounded Ukraine, attacks by Russia's proxies in Donbas increased. The stage was set for a much wider war. On February 24, 2022, Putin announced what he called a special military operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. He claimed Russia did not intend to occupy the country. But the invasion that followed was a full-scale attack from multiple directions. Russian forces advanced from the north toward Kiev, from the east through Donbas and Kharkiv region, and from the south out of Crimea. The goal appeared to be not merely limited gains, but the rapid collapse or subordination of the Ukrainian state. The invasion was internationally condemned. Many countries imposed sanctions on Russia and began sending Ukraine humanitarian, financial, and military aid. The war also triggered a massive refugee crisis as millions of Ukrainians fled their homes to escape bombardment and occupation. One of the most important early developments was Russia's failure to seize Kiev. Ukrainian resistance was stronger than Moscow had apparently expected. Ukrainian forces defended the capital, attacked supply lines, and slowed Russian columns. Civilian mobilization, intelligence support from partners, and Russia's logistical problems all contributed to the failure of the initial offensive. By early April 2022, Russia withdrew from northern Ukraine and shifted focus to the east and south. This did not end the invasion, it changed its shape. The war became more concentrated around artillery, fortified positions, long front lines, and battles for cities and transport routes. Ukraine's survival as a state was no longer in immediate doubt, but the price was enormous. The conflict had become a war of attrition. Later in 2022, Ukraine launched counteroffensives that changed the map again. In the northeast, Ukrainian forces liberated large areas in and around Kharkiv region. In the south, they retook Kherson city, a major symbolic and strategic victory because it was the only regional capital Russia had captured after the full-scale invasion began. Russia responded by declaring the annexation of 4 partially occupied Ukrainian provinces, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. These annexation claims were widely condemned internationally, especially because Russia did not fully control the territories it claimed. Since then, both Russian offensives and Ukrainian counteroffensives have usually gained only limited amounts of ground. The war has remained intense, but movement has often been slow, costly, and measured in villages rather than sweeping breakthroughs. The human toll of the war has been devastating. The conflict has caused hundreds of thousands of deaths and injuries, including soldiers and civilians. Russia has repeatedly carried out deliberate and indiscriminate attacks on civilians far from the front line, striking cities, energy infrastructure, and other targets that affect daily life. In occupied areas, the United Nations Human Rights Office has reported severe human rights violations. The International Criminal Court opened an investigation into war crimes and issued arrest warrants for Putin and other Russian officials. Meanwhile, the war has expanded beyond Ukraine's battlefield in new ways, including attacks inside Russia by Ukrainian and Ukrainian-backed forces, such as a cross-border offensive into Russia's Kursk region in August 2024. Russia has repeatedly refused calls for a ceasefire. The Russo-Ukrainian war continues because the central issues remain unresolved. Ukraine is fighting to restore control over its internationally recognized territory and preserve its independence. Russia is trying to keep occupied land, limit Ukraine's strategic choices, and reshape the regional order by force. The war has transformed European security, strengthened Ukraine's national identity, pushed NATO and European countries to rethink defense, and isolated Russia from many Western states through sanctions and diplomatic pressure. But it has also created a long, grinding conflict with global consequences for energy, food security, refugees, arms supplies, and international law. The war began with Crimea and Donbas, escalated into a full invasion, and remains one of the defining conflicts of the 21st century. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.